There is a rock in the high desert of New Mexico that rises 1,583 feet straight out of flat, empty ground. No mountain range around it, no geological system it belongs to. Just a single black spire standing alone on the plain, visible from 40 miles in every direction, with long, low walls of rock running outward from its base across the desert floor like the spokes of a broken wheel. The people who arrived in the 1800s looked at it and saw a sailing ship. They named it Shiprock. That name went onto every map. But the peoples who were already there had a different name, one they had used for longer than anyone could measure. They did not call it a ship. They called it Tsé Bit'a'í, the rock with wings, not the rock that looks like a wing, not the rock shaped like a bird, the rock that has wings, as if the wings were a fact about the thing, not a comparison a poet reached for. That distinction is not a small one. That distinction contains the entire mystery. Subscribe now and stay with me, because the story behind that name was documented in 1897, and it is not in any geology textbook. In 1897, a surgeon and ethnologist named Washington Matthews, who had spent decades living among the Navajo, learning their language, recording their oral tradition through direct immersion, documented the specific accounts connected to this rock in his ethnographic record, published through the Bureau of American Ethnology. Matthews was not a casual outside observer. He was one of the most rigorous documenters of Navajo oral tradition in the 19th century. His records are still referenced in academic Navajo studies today. What he recorded about Tsé Bit'a'í was not a decorative legend attached to a dramatic landscape feature. It was a specific historical account preserved with the kind of detail that oral traditions reserve for events that actually mattered of what happened on that summit. And what happened on that summit was not a geological event. Now consider the two names side by side, because everything in this investigation lives inside that comparison. The settlers who named it Shiprock were reaching for the most impressive thing they knew, a great sailing ship under full sail cutting across an ocean. That was their frame of reference. Ships meant trade, wealth, power, the long reach of civilization across the water. So they looked at a rock in the middle of a desert 1,000 miles from any ocean, and they saw a ship. That tells you a great deal about the people who named it. It tells you almost nothing about the rock. The Navajo name was already ancient when those settlers arrived. It did not come from watching ships. These were not a seafaring people, and this was not the sea. It came from something else entirely. It came from the stories, and the stories are far older and far stranger than any ship that ever sailed. The Navajo homeland had a name, Dineta, and its borders were not lines on paper. They were 4 sacred mountains, one standing in each direction, marking the edges of the world the holy people had given them. Everything between those 4 peaks was home, and every part of it carried meaning. The rivers, the canyons, the mesas, nothing in this land was simply scenery. Everything remembered something, and in the center of that land, on a wide and lonely plain in the region where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado all meet at a single point, one shape dominated the horizon above everything else: the spire. You can see it long before you reach it. It rises out of the flat ground like something that does not belong, taller than anything around it, black against the pale desert light. On a still day, it looks like it is watching. On a windy day, when the dust moves across the desert floor around it, it looks like it might move. The Navajo word Tsé Bit'a'í means almost exactly the rock with wings, not the rock that resembles a bird, the rock that has wings, as if the wings were a feature of the thing itself, the way a mountain has a summit or a river has a current. A fact, not a metaphor. The settlers reached for a ship because ships filled their imagination. The Navajo reached for wings because wings were what this place was about. Not the shape of the rock, what came down out of the sky and landed on it. To understand what that means, to understand why an entire people looked at that spire and thought immediately of wings and not of ships, you have to go back to the beginning of their world, to a time the stories describe as the dawn of everything, when the land was new and nothing on it was safe, and the sky above that lonely plain did not belong to the people who lived below it. It belonged to something else, something that had claimed the summit of that rock long before any human being arrived. And what it did from that summit is where this story actually begins. In the Navajo tradition, the world the first people emerged into was not a peaceful garden. It was a world overrun with monsters. Beings the Navajo called the Na'ye, a word meaning the alien ones, the destroyers, enormous unnatural things that fed on human beings and had multiplied until the people could barely survive. Among them was something that ruled the air above the plain, not a predator in any ordinary sense, something that operated at a scale that made ordinary predators irrelevant, a mated pair of creature birds, male and female, with wingspans wider than anything alive in the world today, talons that could close around a grown man, strength enough to lift that man off the earth and carry him straight up into the sky. And they had made their home on the summit of the rock with wings. Picture it the way the old stories ask you to. Two enormous birds riding the thermals, rising off the hot desert plain, circling high above the ground, so high they are barely visible from below, watching. Down on the plain, a single human figure moving across the open ground. A hunter, a traveller, someone alone and exposed with nowhere to hide on that flat and empty landscape. The birds see them, they fold their wings, and they drop. They come down out of the empty sky faster than anything that size should be able to move, talons first. And before the person on the ground even understands what the shadow racing toward them means, the talons close, and the earth falls away. Now they are rising, carried up higher and higher, the desert shrinking below, the black spire growing closer, climbing toward ledges at the summit that no human foot had ever touched, where the young were waiting. The monster birds were not hunting only to feed themselves. They were feeding their fledglings, two young birds in a nest on the summit ledges, growing, always hungry, and the parents brought them food. The method was specific and without variation. Carry the captured person up above the very peak of the rock, 1,583 feet above the desert floor, and at the highest point of the climb, let go. The victim fell the full height of the rock and struck the stones at the base, and the young birds came down and fed on what remained. Hunt, seize, carry, climb, drop, feed, rise, begin again. There was nothing the people could do. How do you fight something that attacks from the sky and nests at the top of a spire no human being can climb? The creatures would see any approach from miles away the moment a person was exposed on the open ground. For as long as anyone could remember, that was simply the shape of the world. The sky above the plain belonged to the winged ones. The people who lived in the shadow of Tsé Bit'a'í lived with a specific and permanent fear, the fear of open sky. You cannot hide from something that hunts from above. You cannot outrun a shadow racing across flat ground. You never know when you step out onto the plain whether the sky will stay empty or whether something enormous will fold its wings and come down for you. That fear had a name, it had a location, and it had a summit that no one had ever reached alive. Now the detail that most retellings of this story move past too quickly. The Navajo were not the only people on this continent who remembered enormous winged beings that ruled the high places and carried off human prey. Across native North America, from the Great Plains to the Great Lakes to the peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, the same shape recurs under different names. Thunderbirds, giant eagles, creatures vast enough to lift a grown person off the ground, tied consistently to storms, to high peaks, and to the open sky above flat exposed terrain. A story told in one place by one people could be that people's imagination. A story that appears across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, with no means of contact, no shared language, no common origin in the conventional timeline, begins to feel less like invention. It begins to feel like the echo of a memory, something that many peoples independently across the full width of a continent were all trying to hold on to at once. The specific hunting method, the seizing, the carrying, the deliberate drop from height, appears with enough consistency across these separate traditions that the variation looks like the natural drift of oral transmission, rather than independent invention. Different peoples describing the same thing from different distances. But for the Navajo, the memory was not general. It was specific, a specific rock, a specific summit, a specific pair of creatures with a specific nest in a specific location that their tradition had preserved with enough detail that when Matthews recorded it in 1897, The account was internally consistent across multiple separate informants who had no reason to coordinate their testimony. That consistency is not the signature of legend. It is the signature of something that actually occupied that ground, and for as long as it occupied that ground, the people below endured it, until the day someone decided the sky needed to be taken back. The monsters of the early world were never meant to last forever. The holy people had not abandoned the human beings to be hunted from the sky without end. Help was coming, but to understand who ended the reign of the winged ones, you have to know where he came from. On the sacred mountains a woman was found. Changing woman, one of the most beloved of all the holy people. The one who embodies the earth itself and the turning of seasons, growing old with each winter and young again with each spring. Changing woman gave birth to twin sons. Their father was the sun. The twins grew with astonishing speed, and even as boys they understood that the world they had been born into was broken. Monsters were devouring the people. The sky above the plain belonged to things that dropped human beings to their deaths on the rocks below. Something had to be done. The elder twin set out on a journey that no one had ever survived, to find his father the sun and ask him for the weapons that could kill the monsters. The road to the house of the sun was guarded by dangers that destroyed anyone who tried to pass, crushing rocks, cutting reeds, boiling sands. He was helped along the way by spirit beings, and he crossed each obstacle and came at last to the turquoise house of the sun at the edge of the sky. There the sun tested him, and to be sure he was truly his son, and he passed every test. When the sun was certain, he gave the twin what he had come for, armor of hardened flint, and weapons made of lightning, arrows of the storm itself, the only things in all creation that could pierce the hide of a monster. The elder twin came back to the earth carrying the lightning. He had a new name now, Naye Nesgani, Monster Slayer. One by one he hunted the destroyers down, the giant whose footsteps shook the ground, the horned monster that charged across the plains, the kicking monster, the tracking monster. One by one the terrors of the early world fell to the lightning his father had given him, and slowly, for the first time, the land began to grow safe. Eventually he came to the wide and lonely plain beneath the winged rock. He came for the Tsé Bit'a'í, the ones who carried their prey to the summit and dropped them. But here he faced a problem that lightning alone could not solve. How do you kill something that lives at the top of a spire that no human being can climb? The moment he stepped onto the open plain, the creatures would see him from miles away. They would take him before he came anywhere near the base of the rock. He could not climb up to them, so he did something far more dangerous. He decided to let them bring him up. Monster Slayer walked out onto the plain, alone, in the open, in exactly the place and exactly the posture that the monster birds had never been able to resist. A single figure, exposed, nowhere to hide on that flat and empty ground. And he waited. He stood there beneath the enormous sky, and he let them see him. It did not take long. High above, a shape shifted. One of the great birds had spotted him. It folded its wings and dropped. It came down out of the sky in that same terrible plunge, faster and faster, talons first, and Monster Slayer did not run. He stood his ground until the last instant. The talons closed around him, and the earth fell away. Now the greatest warrior of the Navajo was the one being carried, rising up the full height of the spire, held in the grip of the monster, climbing toward the nest at the summit, toward the place where no human being had ever arrived alive. The bird carried him higher and higher, Pankmi, up past the ledges, up above the very peak of the rock. And then, exactly as it had done to countless victims before him, it let him go. He fell. But Monster Slayer was not an ordinary person being dropped to his death. He was the son of the sun, wearing armor of flint, carrying the protection of the holy people. As he fell toward the stones that had broken so many others, he was shielded, and instead of shattering on the rocks below, he came to rest on the ledge beside the nest, alive, unharmed. And now he was where no living person had ever stood. He was on top of the winged rock. The two young monster birds were right there in front of him, staring at the thing that was supposed to be their meal. The parents were still out over the plain, still circling, still hunting, with no idea what was waiting for them when they returned, Monster Slayer held the lightning his father had given him. He had gotten himself to the one place on Earth that no enemy was supposed to reach, and the reign of the Winged Ones, the creatures that had ruled the sky above that plane for longer than any living person could remember, was about to end. Monster Slayer killed the parent birds when they returned to the nest. One by one they came back across the plain, but still hunting, still circling, and one by one the lightning his father had given him struck them from the ledge where no enemy was supposed to be waiting. The creatures that had ruled the sky above that desert for longer than anyone could remember fell from the summit of the rock with wings, and the reign of the Nayé was over. But then Monster Slayer turned to the young ones, 2 fledglings still in the nest, helpless, the children of the monsters he had just destroyed, and here the story does something nobody expects. He did not kill them. He lifted the first young bird and he spoke to it. From this day you will no longer prey on the people. You will become the eagle. You will fly high and clean above the earth, and you will give your feathers to carry human prayers up to the holy people. And the creature changed in his hands. It became the eagle, the bird the Navajo still holds sacred above almost all others, whose feathers to this day are used in the most important prayers and ceremonies. Then he lifted the second. You will become the owl. You will fly in the night and give the people signs and warnings in the dark. And it changed and became the owl, whose call in the darkness the Navajos still listen to carefully, because in the tradition that sound carries meaning. Sit with what that means. The children of the monsters that once dropped human beings from the summit of Shiprock, transformed into the 2 most spiritually significant birds in Navajo life. The eagle whose feathers lift human prayers toward the sky. The owl whose voice in the night carries warning. Both of them descended from the creatures that once hunted the people on the plain below. The terror was not erased. It was transformed into something the people could live alongside and even honor. Now the detail that collapses the ancient story directly into the present. Eagle feathers remain among the most protected and most sacred objects a Navajo person can hold. Their possession is protected by specific federal law, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, making unauthorized possession a federal offense punishable by significant fines and imprisonment. The United States federal government extends specific legal protection to the feathers of the children of the monsters that once nested on Shiprock. The ancient story is not frozen in the past. It is operating in the present through the most specific legal protection the United States government extends to any ceremonial object. And the owl still stops a conversation. When an owl calls near a home at night, many Navajo will pause and listen, because in the tradition that sound can be a warning, a sign that something is coming, and that instinct comes directly from the story of what the second fledgling became on the summit of Tsé Bit'a'í. Now, the geological explanation placed beside the oral tradition, not to replace it, to sit beside it. Scientists will tell you Shiprock is the hardened core of an ancient volcano, magma that cooled deep underground and stood exposed after the softer rock around it eroded away over millions of years. The long, low walls running out from the base across the desert are volcanic dikes, sheets of hardened magma left standing like the spokes of a broken wheel. All of that is true, measurable, peer-reviewed, accepted.